Just after the outbreak of the Great War, or World War One as it is now called, Private Burden volunteered and signed up for a life in the army to fight for his king and country. However, he quickly discovered his expectations and the reality were different, and he was no soldier.
Eyes right! Fire!
Private Burden was stationed in the trenches and had seen his friends and fellow soldiers horrifically killed. Mentally impacted, he was sent to a military hospital, but quickly discharged and given orders to head to the front line for more fighting. Disorientated and confused, he abandoned his post and said he was going to visit a friend. The next day, he was recaptured by the British military. He was given a speedy court-martial and shot for desertion. Herbert's experience in the army was short and tragic, but what makes it even more so was the fact that Herbert was just 17 years old when he was executed. He had joined the army as a 16-year-old. Here are the army's rules at the time. You had to be 18 years old to join up, 19 years old to serve overseas. Sadly, Herbert was not the only teenager in World War One to be court-martialed and executed for cowardice, and thousands more underage teenagers were killed in action on the front line. During World War One, England alone had 250,000 underage soldiers fighting for the Allies. The army did announce that they would send underage soldiers back to their parents, but the youngest authenticated British soldier in World War One was Sidney Lewis, and he was just 12. There is a shameful roll call of underage boys that joined the army in World War One and didn't make it, such as Private Thomas Bull, died in action, aged 16. Private James Thomas, aged 15. So how and why did these young boys manage to join up and end up as soldiers fighting on the front lines? To understand the boy soldier problem, we need to briefly look at World War One. It started in Europe in 1914, however it would soon involve most of the countries on the planet, hence it was classified as a world war. The two sides consisted of the Allies, that included Britain, and Central Powers, that included Germany. This war was fought via trenches. The trench systems were roughly 475 miles long, stretching from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss Alps, although not in a continuous line. The distance between the trenches was called no man's land, and it could be as long as 500 metres and as short as 25 metres. When given orders, soldiers were told to leave their trenches and to go over the top of their trenches, run through no man's land and try to attack and take the enemy post. The military leaders for the Allies thought the war would be over in a few months, so did not prepare as many trenches as the Central Powers, so not all trenches were elaborate, dry or well constructed like the one you see in the photo. Most of the time, trenches were just basic constructions. And many miles of trenches were just shallow ditches that the soldiers had to dig themselves. So what was no man's land like for the soldiers? People might look at photos today and see fields of flat grass. But during the war, there were fallen trees, muddy ditches, uneven ground, booby traps, and worst of all, deceased soldiers and body parts. War had become extremely sophisticated in the early 20th century, so running through no man's land, soldiers would be exposed to grenades, machine guns, super powerful flamethrowers. The aircraft invented in 1903 had now been repurposed in World War I to drop bombs. The risk of being killed, maimed, or injured was high, but the strategy was simple. This was a war of quantity. The more men you had charging through no man's land to attack the enemy, the more some of these soldiers were also likely to survive and capture the enemy. So it didn't matter if you were 44 or 14, if you could carry a gun, put on a uniform and go over the top, you were a suitable soldier. As photos from that time show, sometimes the boy soldiers weren't even able to fit into uniforms. You can also see their tiny stature in comparison to older adult males. During World War I, the public had little to no information about modern warfare, and that included teenagers and children. You have to remember, this was 10 years before radio, 20 years before passenger flights were available, 30 years before TV, and 80 years before social media and the internet. The masses had two forms of media: recruitment posters for the wall or newspapers with recruitment posters in them. The military stated boys were simply lying about their ages to join up, while subtly recruiting them at the same time. As the war progressed, more informal words were used on posters like boys or lads instead of men, and this appealed to a much younger demographic. Many recruitment officers either gently coerced boys to lie about their ages when signing up, or signed them up regardless and knew they were underage. Due to all the recruitment propaganda, everyone became ultra-patriotic, and some members of the public started pressurizing random males to go and fight. Horace Illis was a 14-year-old boy selling newspapers on the street. One day a lady on the tram harshly berated him for not joining up and gave him a white feather that symbolized cowardice. He explained he was only 14 years old, and she stated he looked big enough and old enough to fight, and he was still a coward. Racked with guilt and humiliation, he soon joined up at 15. By the time he turned 16, he had been killed in action. In this war, there was no volunteer's remorse, not even for kids who were underage. If you joined up, you just couldn't leave. If you ran away, that would be classified as desertion, and if you were captured, you could face an official court-martial, declared a coward, stripped of all your medals, and executed. Private Burden was not the only teenager to be executed for desertion. Thomas Highgate joined at 17 and was sent to the Western Front, where almost 8,000 British soldiers were killed. He panicked, ran away, and removed his uniform. He had left his post for no more than 2 hours and was captured, court-martialed, and executed. 17-year-old John Bennett never coped with warfare and regretted signing up. During a German gas attack and raid on his trench, he fled. Once the raid was over, he was caught by military police, called a coward, and shot at dawn. James Crozier from Belfast was barely conscious when he was executed, having been given bottles of rum by his friends so he wouldn't suffer. The irony was his mother had followed him to the recruiting office, begging them not to sign him up as he was only 16 at the time. The recruiting officer said no harm will come to him. By the age of 18, he had been executed and labelled a coward. Recruiting boy soldiers was not limited to the UK. Britain was still an empire during the First World War, and they chose to recruit from all their territories. 16-year-old Herbert Morris answered the call to fight for king and country, leaving his village in Jamaica to become a British soldier. Realising he had made a grave mistake on arrival in Europe, he tried to return home several times. On his last unsuccessful attempt, he was caught. Then he was paraded in front of his battalion, mocked, labelled a coward, and shot at dawn a few days after his 17th birthday. Our young soldiers had another option. They could stay. But if they were not able to go over the top and attack the enemy when ordered to do so, regardless of mental health or age, they would be shot on the spot. Shot on the spot was a quicker way than an official court-martial, and this death would be memorialised as dying in action. Harry Patch was just 16 years old when he was sent to the front line.
You had two choices: go over the top or be shot for cowardice. And you had just about 6 seconds to make your mind up.
Stand up and fight!
An order was a rigid command, so soldiers could also be shot on the spot in no man's land, for various reasons such as discarding your weapons or uniforms, as they could be for hiding, not moving, surrendering, or running away from the direction of the enemy. It would take campaigners and fellow soldiers such as Harry Patch almost 90 years to get an official pardon and apology in 2006 for the 306 men and boys officially court-martialed and executed for desertion. The label coward was also removed from their records and military honours restored. There were many reasons for these pardons, including the very young age of some of these executed soldiers. However, a major factor was the existence of shell shock, or post-traumatic stress disorder as we know it now. To gain an empire, British military fought many wars, battles and campaigns. The top military had data from these previous battles that a proportion of professional soldiers had developed severe mental health conditions. But for the smooth running of World War I, they chose to underplay or dismiss that warfare could affect mental health in such a negative way, preferring to state these amateur soldiers were of sound mind and mentally stable. They were simply faking symptoms or just being cowards. The 306 court-martials also tended to coincide with great defeats, so it seems that they were used to prevent others running away or as a misdirection from great losses. There was always the option at the time to imprison or discharge soldiers running away, as not all deserters were executed. Private Bevenstein joined at 16. Throughout his army life, he displayed irrational behaviour. One night he left his post because he said he was cold. He was captured the next day and imprisoned. He wrote to his mother and told her not to worry, he would sort it out. He would be dead before she received the letter. He was no threat to the war effort or his fellow soldiers, and he should have and could have been sent home. Private Walter Williams was considered one of the lucky ones. He was a teenager that survived. However, if anyone still doubts shell shock or PTSD exists, please take a moment to look at the photo of Walter after 2 years in the trenches. The Shot at Dawn Memorial is a publicly funded monument in Staffordshire. It shows 17-year-old Herbert Burden surrounded by 306 posts with all the names of the men and boys shot at dawn during World War I. Please share their stories and be a voice for the previously voiceless.
Army dreamers, Riley Zero, BFBO, Riley Zero. Our little army boy is coming home from BFBO. I've a bunch of purple flowers to decorate Mammy's hero.